You won't believe how good this looks in black and white. So how do you turn a piece of structural engineering, concrete, steel, into a work of art? Well, this is the Severn Bridge, and it crosses the River Severn in the UK. I'm on the Welsh side, and across the water there is England. So what I'm trying to do here is make the water look smooth and creamy, because the water flows through here at such a rate that I'm trying to smooth the whole thing out. So what I'm doing with this is using a Lee Filters big stopper, which basically cuts down the light coming into our lens by 10 stops. And that gives us the ability to slow down our exposure, our shutter speed. When I measured the shutter speed for this shot without the filter, that gave me a 1/15 of a second. Handily, Lee Filters gives an app to show you how long your exposure needs to be with the filter on there. So, I don't know if you can see this. So at 1/15 of a second, it's telling me I need to set a shutter speed of 1 minute with the filter in place. By coming down here early, I was able to get the sun just as it was rising, because it's rising in the east, and so it's just hitting that one side of the bridge at the moment. And that's what I was after, to give it some depth and some perspective, as well as making that water nice and smooth. But it's not just the filter we need to think about, there's other things we need to think about. So like I was saying, we've got to think where the sun's rising and what we want the sun and the light to do on the bridge. And then of course, we need to make sure that we're here when the water is up and moving, because the tidal range here, like I say, a 15-metre tidal range. So the danger is that you don't check the tide times and you can turn up, and this is literally a muddy bank from one side to the other. So to do that, I use an app, again, called My Tide Times, and that told me that, luckily, coinciding with a visit that I had to do to Wales anyway, the tide was going to be high early in the morning. So here I am. So combining two apps, the Lee Filters app, the Tide Times app, the filter itself, sturdy tripod, we can get this bridge, this concrete and steel structure to look something a bit more artistic. So a few things to try and make a long exposure shot nice and easy. First of all, a sturdy tripod. Then setting a self timer so that you're not touching the camera when your shutter opens. So I've just set a 2-second timer, press the button, 2 seconds later it will start the exposure. That means there's no chance of me moving the camera whilst pressing the shutter button. Now with my digital camera, it's really useful that I can preview what I'm seeing with the exposure I'm getting. So even with the 10-stop filter on the front, when I set the 60-second exposure, it showed me, yes, that is going to give me a good exposure, which is really handy, obviously. And then the next thing to remember is turn off any inbuilt stabilization, because we don't want our camera to be sat on the tripod for a minute exposure, for example, thinking, oh, I need to try and adjust for movement. So turn off any inbuilt stabilization. And then once we've taken the shot, take 2 or 3 shots just to make sure there's no movement, making sure we're using manual focus, because again, we don't want the camera to override what we're setting and try and change the focus point. So I'm setting manual focus, I've got the stabilization off, and I've got the self timer on, so there's no chance of the camera moving with me pressing the shutter button. Once we're happy with the shot here, it's basically time to take it back to the studio and process.
So, welcome to the studio. And I'll be honest, this is the part about photography that I probably dislike the most, the post-processing, the editing. And it's not because it's difficult, because I try and make life easy for myself, but it's just, I find myself second-guessing myself all the time. And I'm going to come back to that point in a bit. So let's take a look at the first shot I took that morning. So we can see here that this is just a standard shot. I didn't use the filter first of all, I just wanted to get the framing, and I wanted to get the exposure correct so that I could get that reading of what my exposure would need to be with the filter in place. So we can see here that I've got f10 and it's about 1/13 of a second. So I played around with that for a little bit, and then we got to that exposure of 60 seconds. So we can see here that what I was talking about earlier, the water is moving through really quickly, and we can see here that by almost freezing that water, we can see the chaos, the movement on that water. And although it's nice, you can see the water going through that Severn estuary is actually quite muddy. And because it's quite a muddy bank, and with the amount of water that was flowing through there, if you remember, that was churning up a lot of colour. So it's not the most attractive water to look at straight out of the camera. Talking of straight out of the camera, when I go to take an intentional photograph, which is I try to do most of the time, especially when I'm working with my medium format camera, I try to take an intentional image. And what I mean by that is I'm not hoping that everything will be all right in post-processing. I can't fix everything in post-processing. So I try each time I go out to get a good exposure on the camera, so that when I come back to do the editing, which, as I've said, is not my favourite part of photography, I don't need to do too much. I don't need to try and rescue too much. So this is the straight out of the camera shot. The first shot that I took, we can see there's a lot of chaotic movement on the water, and we can see that it's a bit drab because the water's brown. And so I said earlier, black and white is the way to go. So let's have a look at what I did. Well, first of all, you can see from the toolbar here, I haven't touched the exposure because the exposure is correct, but I have dropped the highlights a little bit, I've raised the shadows a little bit, I've dropped the whites a fraction because there was a bit of burnout in some of those sky highlights, and I've lifted the blacks quite a bit because down here on the bridge support, that was actually quite dark, and so I've just lifted that a little bit. And you can see that with that 60-second exposure, that water is a lot more smooth and creamy. There's still some movement on the water, and that's because of the speed that the water was actually going through, it's actually created like a back eddy, which is repeating on itself on that support, and so you can actually still see there is some movement being created on the back side of that bridge support. But now what I've done is, because I've lifted the blacks a bit, you can actually see detail in those stands, the bridge stands and supports. Now, like I say, editing I don't like so much, so I'm not afraid to use a preset, and I have bought a preset for these that I like to use. But the trick with a preset is get your exposures and get the original image good first, then put the preset on, but then manipulate that preset to make it look how you want it to look. The worst thing you can do is get a preset, smack it on the picture and go, thanks very much, job's done. I've paid for my preset, it should do its job. No, it's not going to do its job, it's there as a guideline. It should be there as a guideline for you. So apply a preset, don't be scared of a preset, I'm not, I love a preset, but then manipulate that preset to how you envisage that image. So we can see now that even in the black and white, we can see that sun starting to rise and starting to actually affect the lens. Over in this bottom corner down here, I'm getting a little bit of light reflection off that water, and I think that's lovely because that actually gives it places a time and place on the image. So over here, the highlights are still good because that's where the sun is. Basically, it's just off the frame here, and it's hitting that water, giving that piece of dimension. Now, like I explained on the video while we were there, I was there early in the morning and I was there before sunrise. And now we can see on the bridge, the sun hitting that one side of the bridge. Now on the other side, we can see it's slightly darker, but it's not completely dark because don't forget, with that sun hitting the water, that is actually reflecting light back onto the bridge. It just lifts those shadows a little bit for us. We don't need to do too much work with that. Now the next thing to think about when you're editing and taking photos of architectural structures like this, or any building really, is getting uprights, because it's very easy to leave what should be an upright structure to have distracting angles where we haven't corrected, and where the lens, being a wide angle lens, has distorted that piece of structure without us realising. Lightroom does a great job for us when we're trying to correct uprights. But I use a piece of software again from a company called DxO called Perspective Effects, and that just gives me a little bit more control, I find. Let me just get another image up on the screen for you here. So what we can see is in the distance here, this electricity pylon is slightly off centre, it's at an angle. And that's because I was using a wide angle lens, and even on a medium format camera, that distortion can be quite significant. Now what we've got to remember, that even though our bridge struts can look centred straight out of camera, we check in the distance over here, you can see that the electricity pylon is actually sat at an angle. And because I put my camera at a slight angle to get that bridge to come into the frame quicker, we've exaggerated the angle of that electricity pylon in the distance. So by putting that through DxO's Perspective Effects, I can correct that, as you can see in the black and white image. With that early morning light hitting that one side, we can now see it in full effect on this black and white image. We can see that the sun is hitting that side of the bridge, because we can now see that it's gone above the clouds that were there first thing in the morning. We can see it just coming into frame. It's creating that reflection on the water, which is beautiful. It's also just highlighting that one side of the bridge, and that gives us depth. That gives us perspective, but it also gives us detail, because the shadows are still nice where the sun is on the opposite side to those metallic structures. On the other side of the bridge, we've got that little bit of light that's reflecting off the water, so that's lifting the shadows for us automatically. So I think this black and white image now, considering it's a bridge, a metal architectural structure, I think this is a really beautiful image. However, I came into some turmoil, and that's because I envisaged this whole image as a black and white, but then I tried a colour version, and now I'm in turmoil because I like this colour image. I've kept it light and airy, which I think it needed because it was so early in the morning, and because it was such a beautiful autumn sun, and the sunrise just hitting that water, which is obviously in a lot more effect. You can see that in colour. The sun, now you can see the sun is coming into this side of the frame. It's reflecting on that water there. Those colours now, really creamy and really nice. It almost looks the same as the black and white, but if you look here at the red warning lights on the bridge structures, you can see those lights are nice and red. And the reason they're red, they actually flash. But because we've done a 60-second exposure, we've caught more than one flash. And so those beacons are nice and bright. And now with the image zoomed in, you can also see I've added some film effect grain, which I think adds to that creamy, smooth, morning, fresh look. I didn't want the whole thing to be too clinical. It is a piece of engineering there to do a job. And it's been affected by weather, by dust, by dirt, and I've left the effects of those environmental impacts on the bridge. We can see up here that the dirt marks and the effects that the weather and dust and dirt have had on the bridge, I've left on there. And I think that adds to the image, because the image now is creamy and smooth and beautiful, but there's also a grittiness and a reality to the image. So now, of course, like I say, I'm in turmoil, because I actually really like the colour image, but I really also like the black and white image, because that's how I first envisaged my shot. Which do you prefer? Leave a comment below. Which do you prefer, the black and white image or the colour image? Actually, leave 2 comments. I want you to tell me, do you prefer the black and white image or the colour image? And also, do you think I should reopen my print store on my website and sell images a bit like this? I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to leave a comment, black and white or colour, and should I open a print shop? Again.